Welcome to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. Problem solvers have problems too. So here at Behind the Podium, I, Jared Cohen, and my co-host Alexander Ellis discuss the struggles, philosophies, demands, and practices of the coach, or said more broadly, health and wellness practitioner. To provide quality coaching is to enhance someone's life in an everlasting and unfolding way. This is not easy and requires a lot of due diligence and self-mastery on the part of the coach to be able to perform. So without further ado, join us as we dig deeper into the depths of the coach's mind. Welcome back, or welcome to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. I am Jared Cohen. Joined with me is my partner in crime,
Alexander Ellis.
And today we are here, and on our minds is the topic of principle-based coaching, the importance of principles over methods, context over content, and coming back to this concept of how you infuse the why into your teachings so that your students, your clients, your athletes are left with something tangible that is allowing them to be more self-sufficient and self-empowered to make the learning their own.
Mm-hmm. And I think this will also be an interesting topic to look into, because as coaches and practitioners, we are taking and reading, so many different methodologies and training programs, and how to, integrate all of that into your teaching can be challenging.
Yeah, it's definitely what I consider one of the inherent struggles in the role. How well do we sift through the weeds? So at the very least, those that we're working with don't have to. I was having a conversation with my current martial arts instructor, and it was interesting. We got into somewhat inadvertently got into this conversation about coaching philosophy, and he was saying how one of his instructors was of the type in which if he experienced it as a student, he felt that you had to experience it too, regardless of its service of coaching or service of how it was going to help you get to where you needed to be, rather. And he was saying versus his approach is more of being the guide, in which it's like, look, if I've already gone down this path and I realize it's a dead end, as a coach, I don't want you to go through that path. And so again, it comes back to this point about what due diligence, what even self-experimentation we've done so that we can say, hey, like, we've tried it this way, like, just trust me, like, I can help you take the shortcuts you need to take. If it took me 10 years to kind of figure this out, then potentially a good coach should help you figure it out in 5 years, right? Because based on our ability to, or our role to distill all this stuff, we want to package it in a way that is going to be more successful for the client to experience.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah, you have to almost like digest it and embody whatever that topic is, so that you can like spit it back out into that context or language that your students understand. And that's going to be different for each grouping of students, for each client. And I'm just thinking as far as my practice of, distilling it for my students that I meet with weekly versus in a teacher training, because there's a different level of understanding, as a group. And you have to be able to explain that both ways. How you explain it to grandma is going to be different than how you would explain it to your, most dedicated student that you've been working with for a very long time who gets it.
Yeah. But I think the common denominator is the principles, right? That
exactly,
regardless of whether I'm talking to grandma or I'm talking to a fellow colleague, the shared aspect, the highlighted component, the takeaway should be this principle orientation. And that there's a time and a place to discuss methods and the various pieces of content that make up the principle or that the principle relates to. But I think we can definitely get lost in the forest, or get lost in the trees, rather, missing the forest when we get too caught up and potentially blinded by the methods. Because we know as coaches, as practitioners, consuming all the various information and trying to figure out what works and doesn't work, it's overwhelming. And a lot of times it's just repetitive.
Yes.
And I think when we can take a step back and try and see the principles that allow for a little bit more of a path for similarity's sake, that I can see what is actually similar between the various methodologies, then I can start distilling principles that are potentially more useful than arguing or getting caught up in the nuances of what others are arguing is different
Right.
between practices.
Feet parallel or turned out 5 degrees. Like, well, what are you trying to get at here?
Exactly. Yes. Good example for sure.
Well, what is the phrase? There's multiple ways to skin a cat, and
Yeah.
It's true. And I think nobody is creating anything super unique at this point. You're not reinventing the wheel here, and it just comes down to whatever course you're taking or whatever person you're learning from, it's their interpretation of these underlying principles. There's some universal principles when it comes to movement. And so with each new teacher that you study with or each new methodology that you study, to really think about, what can I get from this? And it's not necessarily, oh, here's 35 new exercises, but, well, why do these 35 exercises work together well? Or what is the nuance with this, this new system that I can then apply into my life, versus like, well, here's how you do it, and this is the only way to do it, and this is how I'm going to do it for the rest of my life, which is fine-ish, but also in my mind, and I imagine many of our creative coaches' minds, a little bit boring.
Yeah, and limiting.
Yeah.
And also paralyzing, I would say.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm kind of in an interesting place now with a little more coaching maturity and perspective, where I can look back at some of the things I've learned and see what was really sound in terms of its principles and how it has continued to positively influence me today. But also within some of those same practices, I can also see what was very limiting and to this day still potentially paralyzing, that I'm still having to kind of live down some of the habits of certain methods that I was led to believe were like the only way. And it just really makes me think about my role as a coach going forward, like needing to be much more careful about what I'm saying, right? And that like I'm not coming off in a manner that is suggesting that this is the only way or suggesting that this is, like do or die. And I think sometimes that approach, it has the intended effect you're looking for temporarily, right? It really conveys the severity of potentially the method, or maybe how you're seeing it in that moment, the principle. But ultimately, what you're doing is you're creating fear, and that fear is limiting, and it's ultimately getting away from what I would hope would be the overall purpose and guiding, and one of the guiding principles of the coach and practitioner, which is to create a feeling of self-sufficiency, empowerment, self-expression, And we lose that if we're caught up in feelings of do or die.
Yeah, and I've fallen into that trap myself as well. When I was, you were saying, was earlier in my teaching career, gotten up on my soapbox and said, don't ever, ever,
Yeah.
ever do this, ever. And hurt feelings by that. And yeah, absolutes. I'm just trying to think. I mean, there are some things like never do this.
Yeah, it's so hard to figure out, like, because I think there is a place for absolutes, but
yeah,
it's a fine line, you know.
Well, and there's so much gray area.
Yeah.
And I try now to just, again, from learned experience, so hopefully for those listening, don't make the same mistakes that I have. It's a lot easier to say, this isn't the only way. I'm not saying that, the way I'm teaching this. And in yoga, let's take downward facing dog, for example, which is like the ubiquitous yoga pose. Like, when people think yoga, that's the pose they think. And there are a million different ways people teach it.
Yeah.
And many people teach it saying this is the absolute way. And when you teach that differently, I have now found it very helpful to almost like give a disclaimer at the start. Hey, we're going to do this pose or whatever. And it's probably going to be a little bit different than you have learned in the past, but be open-minded. And I will explain my reasoning, explain the underlying why for the whole process so that now you can make your own decisions if that's the route you want to go. And that's also where I find that understanding the, anatomy and biomechanics underneath movement, because that's always there. That also helps to kind of, sift out the nonsense movement from, what actually makes sense.
Yeah. And also potentially what one thing is being used for in service of another thing. And I think this is where it doesn't necessarily have to be right or wrong, but to create principles around that concept of skill transferability. If downward dog is the only thing you're training, then arguably you have a lot of like leeway with it. It's like, do it however you want, because it's like your only thing in a sense. I mean, like it's downward dog in a vacuum, but perhaps
do it one-handed.
Right. Perhaps if we're trying to use downward dog as this great movement to assist with the grander scheme of movements and play a part in a wide repertoire of movements, or breathing and relaxation and variance, then I think we may come to it with a different context, a different why, different principles that are oriented the way they are in service of its transferability to other concepts.
For sure.
And other movements, that like it's not, this movement is not happening in a vacuum. And I think sometimes the confusion between methods and principles is related to that, is that we are forgetting about what this means outside of this thing. And programming is a great example of that, right? Like, what are the principles of programming versus like, what are the methods? Because there are a lot of methods, and there's a lot of like ways to really geek out. Just like there are a lot of, I guess you could think about it like there's a lot of different software systems, right? You could use Excel, you could use numbers, you could use different variations of the same concept of just tracking data. But ultimately what's important is for someone to just understand what are the most useful ways to track data and not get so caught up in like, why one method is better than the other. Because ultimately that's not really helping them with the main objective.
Mm-hmm. And, just to clarify, like method-wise, we're speaking of like, a specific style of a movement principle or a specific school of thought. Because, when you start to like look at the bigger picture, there are a lot of repeating themes. But that's the greatest thing is, oh, well, here's this idea of shoulder stability from this angle and that angle and this angle. And when you're able to put them all together, then you as the practitioner have an even better understanding of the idea.
Right, exactly. And when you're able to deliver that for the client, they have a better understanding of the idea. They also have a moment that I feel is that takeaway, where it's the aha moment, for them to be like, oh wow, like I feel like this makes sense now because of how I can relate it to something else, and that's much more tangible than what may be the experience with method fixation, and that being more memorization. I'm trying to memorize what this style tells me to do. I'm trying to memorize these sequences, and there's a place for that, of course. But I think as coaches, we need to constantly be coming back to principles and helping clients to distill those and refine them.
For sure. And I think if we were to think of this in terms of nutrition, there is no one diet to rule them all.
Yeah.
And, one person's no food, no eat food, like I can never eat this one, that's never going to work, is another person's like totally go ahead, it's 100% fine. And I find that I don't understand why, maybe because it's more like concrete, but using food, and also because I love food, using food to explain stuff seems to help. And so when I'm like, listen, you need to be doing all types of movement and encouraging my students to have creativity. And then if I say, well, hey, if you ate nothing but spinach every single day, like, well, spinach is good for you. Well, yeah, but if you eat nothing but spinach 3 times a day, 7 days a week, you're going to be missing out on a lot of nutrients. And so variety in terms of training, which also comes from just understanding the principles, because then you can apply it to anything that you do. Right.
But then you get into the weeds potentially of like, well, how much variety?
However much you want, okay? This is the episode in which we say nothing matters and do whatever you want.
Do what you want. Yeah, I think, well, food is one we can use as an example potentially of like, all right, what are the principles related to eating, or what are some potential principles that would be more positively serving whomever you're working with versus merely do's or don'ts, or recipes of like only eat these foods.
Don't eat after 5 p.m. Well, why?
Yeah, right. And I think like I think it also goes back to this conversation of the progression of teaching, right? Like there are times in which the principle dictates that methods are going to win the day periodically, yes. Right? That like these are the methods we're going to follow for this period of time until we get to this point in which we're going to adopt new methods, but this is all within the grand scheme of principles that are dictating these decisions. So actually, I was going to ask you this, which was, if we take the concept of self-massage, rolling, otherwise known as, what would be the principles you would distill for the average person, and even another coach that's like, hey, I'm confused. There's a lot of talk about like, don't roll before, only roll after, don't roll your IT band, and so now we're getting caught up in some of the different coaching preferences and different methodologies, whether it's a foam roller or it's this
Right.
tool. And so how would you guide someone in a principle-based way as it relates to self-massage and rolling?
Hmm. I think first I would start with do what feels good.
Okay.
And knowing, like whatever you do, if you don't feel better tomorrow or you don't feel later, you probably shouldn't do that specific thing. Secondly, there are some do's and don'ts.
Yeah.
Like don't roll the front of the throat. Don't roll your
Yeah.
esophagus. It
Right.
doesn't need to be rolled. Don't roll soft cartilage prominences like right at the bottom of the rib cage or the tailbone. And don't roll on open or bruised, things like that. Like there's some do's or don'ts. Don't roll on broken skin. Don't roll on broken bones. And then outside of that, I think experimentation is really good. So that goes back to that do what feels good. And I find, and the reason why I use yoga tune-up therapy balls and role model method balls is that they are easily not transferred. Just whether you're super experienced or not, the chances of you injuring yourself are a lot lower because it's a softer, more forgiving tool. Because there's people who use barbells to do stuff, and
Instrument assisted soft tissue.
Yeah, and I'm personally, but then also there's a therapeutic application of that well, and it's called Grafton.
Yeah, right.
Which comes from, I believe, a Chinese soft tissue release where they use stones. So there's been hard tools all along. For me personally, it's not my jam. For other people, it might be, and that's totally fine. But I think if you understand, what is it that you are trying to achieve?
Right.
And if you're like, well, I just want to feel better, but every time I roll with this really hard kettlebell, like I feel way worse after. Maybe that's not the best tool for you or that spot. But that's not to say it won't be down the line. So I guess I would say do what feels good, and everything else comes from there.
Yeah, and I think the other piece for me, based on what you said, is principle one would be know what you're what you're trying to do or what your intention is when you roll. Mm-hmm. Try and determine that intention first, especially as a coach that is wanting to use rolling or some type of self-massage as a part of their overall practice that they're prescribing to their class or their team, et cetera, et cetera. So don't just prescribe it because you've seen other people doing it, or don't just prescribe it because you think it's good. Like what is it in service of? And for me, the reason I come back to the yoga tune-up balls is because of their ability to be in service of proprioception and embodiment. The fact that it's a tool that has this yield capability and allows for grip and slide and some kind of malleability makes it so that somebody can roll on these balls and be more aware of their body in space. They can feel things that they wouldn't otherwise feel if they were just experiencing temporary pain and the release of pain. And that's where I think some of the harder tools for me wouldn't be as beneficial based on the purpose, the intent, my principle of wanting to get someone more aware of their bodies and potentially more able to contract certain muscles that they may otherwise not be able to if there wasn't some tool to create that awareness.
Mm-hmm. And I think you definitely need, again, variety. So the person if you're only using lacrosse balls, barbells, other metal tools, your body still craves that soft touch. And if you can't get soft touch from a manual therapist, that's where a softer tool comes into play. And there's even softer tools than the yoga tune-up balls that are, inflated. I know there's the Gorgeous ball, but, Melt Method has very small and inflated balls. And so, if you are not looking to go all the way deep and maybe just want to do some superficial fascial work, that's a great tool for that,
Yeah.
So, again, just like you're saying, what are you trying to accomplish? And then understanding the why. Like, what will each of these tools or each of these methods, what will they bring? And how will that serve the ultimate accomplishment of the goal that you're trying to achieve?
Right. And that's another example, too, where method overload is when we get too caught up in, do I use the melt balls? Do I use the yoga tune-up balls? Do I use the lacrosse ball? Do I use the supernova?
Right.
When really the principles should be the same based on what you're trying to accomplish. And so one of the other principles I would come back to is improving position for movement. So whether I'm using a lacrosse ball, I'm using a melt ball, I'm going to be concerned with what movement I am going to be doing in whatever my training is. And then I'm going to use that tool in order to improve the movement, which is specific to the movement. So if my arms are going overhead, then I'm going to think about taking that tool more in the vicinity of my upper back and my shoulder region, and then continue to move in that way with the ball in these different regions so that I can create some more space in those adjacent areas. And now, if I find myself in a situation where I don't have my preferred method or my preferred tool, but there's a tennis ball, I can still apply the same principle. And now I'm not limited, or I don't feel like oh my God, I can't train today because I don't have this thing. And that's what I think is what we as practitioners should be working toward, to create that freedom, and the knowledge that parts the sea, so to speak, for whomever you're working with, and trying to craft a greater understanding for.
Yeah, which is totally like how to inspire your students, your clients' creativity. And that comes from them understanding the principles. Like, here's why we're doing it.
Yeah.
And here's, some things you could do, but you could do a lot of things here,
Which, little shout out to our previous guest, Max Schenk, I think has done a really good job with his 5-minute flow.
Yeah.
If you get the chance to check out his 5-minute flow website and the product that he has associated with that now, or his 5-minute flow seminar, what's really nice about that is it's giving you principles and then saying, okay, now go play. Much like the world, or at least the ideal theoretical world with music teaching. Here are some chords. Now go, put them together in a bunch of different variations. I think Jill Miller, creator of Yoga Tune-Up, her course, balls, the role model ball sequencing and innovation, is reflective of this topic that we're talking about, of, hey, let me give you some principles related to rolling, And now, like, I want you to experiment. Like, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now try going 5, 2, 1, 3, 4, and try going 4, 2, 1, 3. So you have these ingredients. Now mix them up, and hopefully with that mixing and matching, you yourself are actually uncovering more principles. So it's this
Yeah.
This forever giving process of self-knowledge.
Hmm. Yes, and that just reminds me so much. I'm thinking of how many times in my life this idea of play and creativity has come up. So I am classically trained in piano and took lessons for 8 years as I was growing up. And classical piano, it wasn't composing I was taking. It was, here is this piece of music and you will learn it, and it is already indicated with how loud you should play and how fast you should play, and there's tempo indications. Like, everything is laid out for you, and you are just performing it. And in my high school, we had a very talented jazz band, full ensemble group that I was a part of. And so I kind of outgrew classical piano and wanted to start taking jazz lessons. And so I did. And my teacher, my jazz piano teacher, was like, great, well, here's the chords. Now just play something. I'm like, but what are the notes? And you mean you just want me to play like, I can't do that. I need you to tell me what to do. And I think that at the time was too big of a leap.
Yeah.
That was like, here, let's go from A to E.
Right.
And down there, like, just do whatever. And I was like, no, I'm not ready. I'm not ready. And I'm seeing now it has actually taken me, another 12-ish years to finally, even with my movement practice, to begin to be creative. And part of that has to do with the fact that we have so much access to stuff. So I know sometimes we think of like, oh, it's really overwhelming. And I do have a creative brain. And I am very creative, except when it comes apparently to performance. And so, being able to see things on Instagram and see videos on YouTube and see things shared on Facebook of movement, and then being able to bring that into my own practice, I'm truly, honestly, finally now at a place where I feel like, oh, well, you could do this and you could do that. And what if you did this, and comfortable with that? And how I got there was through experimentation and play. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm not teaching, circus performance type stuff. So like, if you fall, you're on the ground already. Yeah. The stakes are much lower. Right. What's the worst that could happen? I understand enough to not break bodies. Yeah, and as teachers, we are almost like guidance counselors. I'm not going to do it for you, and I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm going to lay it out and leave that option up to you.
Yeah. Well, I like what you said too about the easy access of information, which is this balancing act. Because I think while information can inspire and promote creativity, it can also be a limiter. So that there's also this aspect of creativity needing constraints, and I think that goes back to the learning process, and that progression is helping somebody to limit the pieces that they are focused on, so that they can have an opportunity to go deep within these pieces. So it kind of makes me think about, in movement, if we're taking someone that has no training background, teaching them a push-up and a deadlift, and only those two movements for an extended period of time, like maybe it's a month, and we just continue to refine and slightly tweak the exposure to those movements, right? That there's a lot of different ways you can pick something up off the ground, and there's a lot of different things to pick up off the ground.
Yep.
Similarly, there's a lot of different ways to push yourself away from something, and there's a lot of different things to push away from, whether it's the ground, it's dumbbells, it's rings, it's an ice chest. I don't know.
Yeah.
But so that now I've limited the variables to go deep into the principles that are experienced within these two movements. So neutral spine, core to extremity, creating tension, the connectivity between what my lower body is doing with my upper body, and we really we just kind of go nuts with that. And I think that's a good example of simplicity and creativity going hand in hand, also simplicity and principles going hand in hand, and then we expand versus potentially the experience of I go into a CrossFit gym and now it's like, all right, so we got the push up, we got the squat, we got the snatch, we got the clean and jerk, we got the pull up, and like every day it's like, wait, what's that again? Wait, what's that? What's, and it's just kind of nothing is really sinking in.
Yeah.
And so that is really where, as a coach, I feel responsible to both provide variation, as you're saying, novel stimuli, right? We know that is a key component for motivation, but also to not take that so far that it's just a total rat race of keeping up. And sorry, go ahead.
No, I'd say that's a great point. Totally. Yeah, because you can get super overwhelmed. I've been there too.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like just take a few things, master those, and then move on.
Right. And this is something we've talked about for another episode topic, but I think it ties in, which is accountability, and the culture of accountability that we're all guilty of, wanting to look over what's happening, to look at what's happening over there. And the whole point of having a coach is for that coach to build some constraints, to say yeah, there's a lot going on, but let me help you just kind of stay here for now so that you can experience this to the fullest. And helping to reinforce that message and the reasoning for that, versus maybe instigating or allowing someone's behavior to go to that place that is a little more scattered, and therefore not helping them to reinforce these principles that are going to help them be more successful in the long run.
Simplicity.
Yeah, I think that's really the takeaway that we're talking about, and the purpose of principles versus methodological madness.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and I'm thinking too, about which we've talked about, how to distill all the stuff online. I think you need to make boundaries for yourself.
Yeah, boundaries.
And that might be limiting the number of courses you take.
Yeah.
Even if finances aren't an issue.
Right.
That might also mean boundaries around social media time. There's a reason I'm not on Instagram 24 hours a day, because my brain would explode.
Yeah.
So maybe if you are feeling a sense of overwhelm from whatever it is, whether it's the amount of information online or in person that you are getting, I challenge you to just take a moment and think, well, how am I accessing this information, and how is that contributing to this sense of overwhelm? whether it's, oh, well, I'm adding an additional, I'm going to X number of classes, maybe I'm going to too many classes, or maybe I'm reading too much and I need to diversify what I'm doing,
Yeah, this is a constant struggle for me, for sure. I was recently working with our second guest, Elizabeth Whiff, related to this topic, which we distilled as the principle of not right now.
Yeah.
And needing to continually come back to that and be disciplined about that. And I think that's another piece to principles, is that they require discipline in order for them to work. That there's a commitment to them in order for other things to fall into place. And I think I'm now into my second year of my master's program, and it was I'm only now finally starting to let go of other things in order to be more immersed in the master's program, which I don't necessarily regret the things or the opportunities that I took on last year, but there's definitely an overwhelm and a burnout that takes place with that, and just a kind of impulsiveness that I need to continually be aware of. For instance, seeing Kelly Starrett's new coaching course come out and being like, oh yeah, okay, let's do it. And needing to take a step back and be like, well, how is that really going to help me right now? Especially based on what I'm currently doing and how I'm trying to make what I'm currently doing the main event. And that's the principle that I need to be disciplined with, so that I don't take on too much and then become more overwhelmed and overloaded with competing ideas and concepts, which is part of the process. It's part of learning, is being comfortable with that cognitive dissonance, but there's a time and a place for it. And ultimately you can be more in control of how much of that you're taking on.
Oh yeah. One thing I've started doing, just as far as articles online, there's bajillions of articles and I want to read them, and I don't have time to, sit there and really get into them. But there's this app called Pocket. I don't know. I think I shared it with you. But you can have it on your cell phone. You can have it on your tablet. You can have it on your laptop. I have a browser extension installed. And so when I come across something that's really cool, I say, great, let me go throw this in my pocket. And it'll be there when I'm ready, when I'm focused on that task at hand.
Yeah.
Versus
in my pocket.
I put it in my pocket. Versus oh my God, I have 500 things I need to do. And let me drop everything and change focus.
Yeah.
That is my challenge, is not to lose momentum by just oh wait, look at that. It's kind of the dog from Up, Doug.
Yeah.
And he's having a full-on conversation. He's squirrel. That's my attention span. And so any tools that you can put in place to help focus that. But yeah, this not right now, and the distraction, I think all this stuff we talked about with Elizabeth will help to make the important things more clear.
Yeah.
For yourself. And for me, that was, really digging deep and uncovering, what was it? What is the why for me that makes me the most happy? And then it's much easier. And when you have brought that to the surface and you are aware of it, it's easier in the moment to decide, is this applicable? Is this going to get me anywhere? Yes, no.
Yeah, I like that. It reminds me of similarly the topic of frameworks. Michael Gervais, who has the podcast Finding Mastery and is a sports psychologist, high performance coach, his interview model on that podcast, when talking to high performers about their path to mastery, it involves 3 pillars. So the first pillar is, one's journey, what's the path they've taken, what's their background like. Second pillar is what psychological framework do they have, or psychological frameworks that they operate under within. And thirdly are what are the mental skills that they use to get through it all and handle the various elements of adversity. And one of the points he makes is that with a really strong psychological framework, the mental skills are less important. It comes back to, like, if I have these guiding principles, then the things I do, they'll just kind of happen organically. And I don't need to be as focused on the specificity of the to-dos, because I'm continuing to be in service of this greater why, or this context. I heard this one from, just to offer a psychological framework. I heard this. I haven't read the book, but it's called Resilience by Eric Greitens. He's a former Navy SEAL, and apparently he talks about a framework in the book, which is identity, action, feeling versus feeling, action, identity. And I really like the simplicity of that framework, or similarly principle, right? That if I start with the end in mind, if I start with who I want to be, what I'm trying to resemble, what I'm trying to be representative of, then I'm going to take the action in service of that, and then I'll feel a certain way. Versus if I start with the emotional baggage or fluctuation of, let's say, I'm really tired, and then act in a certain way based on that tiredness, now I'm ending up not necessarily where I wanted to go. And so with that example, potentially what I do along the way is less important than me having that framework as my guiding principle.
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, I'm interested to read that book.
Yeah, me too. It's in my pocket.
Throw it in your pocket. Come back to it later. So, yeah, I think, the recurring theme that keeps coming up is having systems in place to deal with things as they come up, rather than like being in the middle of a burning house and be like, okay, what should I do now? You need to know where are you going?
Yeah.
And and how you're going to get there. And that is also, back to like working specifically with a client, where does that client want to go?
Right.
And is this new idea or exercise or, methodology that you're trying to bring in, is that going to serve this greater purpose?
Yeah, exactly. It reminds me of the conversation we had with Justin Marcus, in which he was talking about having an initial consultation with a client to figure out their why, so then you could appropriately provide the how.
Yep.
And as coaches, we should be helping. I think a part of it too is that a lot of people don't know their whys, and to be fair, I think even those of us that do, it's always evolving, it's always changing, and so a good coach is helping to help create some clarity around that. And then pull that out, extract it, help to unpack it, reveal it, and then based on that, okay, now provide some methods that are, again, in service of the why, or principles in which now the individual can apply their own methods based on what has been understood and revealed as the framework.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So go back, listen to every episode, and you'll be golden.
Yeah. For us too.
I know. Yeah.
Do you have any, or what would your recommendation be for helping people to create their own systems in life that they can rely on for more of a lifestyle of design versus things happening by default?
Um, I think actually goal setting is very helpful. And it's just, I love Elizabeth Whip. I need a shirt that just says, I heart Elizabeth Whip or something, because she's been so influential in my life. And it's great to hear that you guys are all also working together. Because I was speaking with Elizabeth in December. And, she's like, so how are your workouts going? What are you doing? I was a little year-end coaching. And I'm like, yeah, they're going. Like, I'm doing stuff. But there wasn't really, I was doing stuff without an end goal in mind. And so it kind of started to feel a little bit routine and, like, well, what's the point?
Yeah.
And then so setting a goal around that, and then, speaking about it with you because you do my programming, Coach Jared. And then we had something collectively to work together, was fun again. And then to achieve that goal. So I tested it last night, and I totally did a pull-up.
Nice.
And as soon as we get off this call, I'm going to go do some more. And so that makes, for me at least, it easier to, even with all the different types of workouts and styles, and, I'm listening to what you're telling me to do, and then also gave me freedom to explore some other stuff as well, because it all ends up feeding that same goal.
Yeah.
So as far as coaching, that, again, a discussion with your client. What do you want?
Yeah.
And what do you want to be able to do? And then figuring out how you can help serve that. I recently worked with a client who their goal was to walk again following a surgery. Great. Let me think of, all of the components of walking. What are you missing?
Yeah.
Also, who else are you working with? And how can I complement that?
Oh, nice.
This person was working with, acupuncturists and massage therapists and physical therapists. So I don't want to do hip bridges because I know you're doing that with them.
Yeah.
What else can we do? So I think, like Justin Marcus's idea of this, initial consultation can provide a lot of information rather than just jumping in and then trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
So, ask questions, do things. And just as you would do the initial consultation for a client, ask those same questions of yourself. What do you want?
Yeah.
What do you hate? What do you love? How can you do more of what you really like instead of what you don't? It could be that simple.
For sure. Put it in your pocket.
And on next episode, Jared will sing us his new song, Put It in Your Pocket.
Actually, I recommend, let me just quickly make sure I have the exact name of the song that I'm thinking of. Mm-hmm. And it's the band Wolfpack. Wolfpack, so Vulfpeck.
Huh.
Which is German, not for a wolf pack, but for like a wolf kiss, like a kiss, like a peck. And there's on their album that came out in 2015, Thrill of the Arts, there's a song called Back Pocket. And like the chorus is like, put it in my back pocket, put it in my... Anyway, a little foreshadowing. The drummer of that band, Theo Katzman, who also has his own solo career, I would like to get on the podcast.
Theo, if you're listening.
Yeah, Theo. There you go. So with that in mind, music recommendations and all, any final thoughts, Miss Ellis?
Yeah. Never underestimate the power of reflection.
Yeah.
And that can only happen personally, I feel, if you are documenting along the way. Because how can you remember everything? Let's just be real. You're not going to remember everything. I've heard people say, well, I'm trying to improve my memory. And I'm like, listen, I'm just going to be realistic. Yeah. There's no way that I'm going to remember everything. So I write it down.
Right.
And then you have stuff to look back and be like, oh, that was cool. I forgot about that. So whether that's in programming of, workouts or of your life or of your business or whatever, never underestimate the power of reflection.
Yeah. And with that, as you're saying, but I'll just draw it out directly, is not just reflecting, but the act of reviewing your reflections.
Yep.
Which is something I definitely don't do enough. And I think that's a great way of getting to distilling some truth, distilling your own principles. Because you'll find like, oh yeah, this entry, this little journal from 2 years ago is like the exact same feelings I'm feeling right now. And then you can kind of be like, well, what's going on there? Or even I've been doing some gratitude journaling in the mornings. And so, now I have like 20 pages of things I'm gracious for. It would probably do me good to like look back at those and just start building some accumulated awareness, specific awareness of what I'm gracious for. And then just thinking about how can I build my life more around that. Hence the lifestyle by design versus by default, and the systemization to help reinforce that. I'll also recommend the Tim Ferriss podcast with Robert Rodriguez, the filmmaker. He is a really fascinating guy. He is known for his movies like Desperado, From Dusk Till Dawn, Sin City.
Oh wow!
And a large part of the interview is them talking about reflection and journaling. Apparently, Robert Rodriguez writes like everything down and just in a Word document, and he's a big fan of.
Oh wow!
Yeah, he talks about what I actually find cool is he talks about it in the context of being a dad. That like for him, it's so important to document everything he's doing with his kids because he just won't remember otherwise. And just how powerful it is for him as a dad to go back and be like, oh, like this is what we did on this weekend and relive and be really engaged in the experiences and the accumulation of these moments he's had with his loved ones by just having this very robust repertoire of documentation, which I just found really fascinating.
Yeah, that's really cool. Because there's only so much that Facebook memories can provide.
Yeah, which they've been great, by the way.
Ugh, I always find it so depressing. I'm like, oh my God, that was 10 years ago.
Yeah, that kind of that gets me a little bit too. Yeah.
Which is also crazy to think that I've been an active member of a website for.
Oh yeah, that is crazy.
Boy. Man, how time flies when you're having fun. So you might as well document some of it because you sure as hell not going to remember it all.
Most def. All right. Lastly, I will leave everyone with a quote. This is from The Art of Learning by Joshua Waitzkin. In the end, mastery involves discovering the most resonant information and integrating it so deeply and fully it disappears and allows us to fly free. And that is my feelings about the purpose of principles in a nutshell.
Truth. Love it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that quote. Everything will be up on Behind the Podium podcast.com. And I also just want to put out a request for reviews, because if you're listening to the show and you're enjoying the show, we would super appreciate you to hop over either onto Google Play or the iTunes store, specifically the iTunes store, to leave a review so that other people can find and share this podcast as well. So go write us a review, please.
Please help spread the word. We love the opportunity to reach more headphones.
Yep.
All right, till next time.
Bye.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to Behind the Podium. Unveiling, the coach. If you have enjoyed what you listened to, head over to iTunes and leave us a review. More information on each episode and the podcast in general can be found at behindthepodiumpodcast.com. We'll catch you next time.